Okay, so now you've worked through these narratives in what I hope is meaningful ways. You've worked through Ehud, you've cast him, and you find out that his narrative is actually fairly comical. Um, it's about a guy that goes and enacts a revolution against an evil fat king and does it through trickery. And that this fat king is actually kind of comedic because he is so fat that Ehud's sword sinks into his belly and is covered up with fat. And then this evil king, Ehud, his poop spills on the ground and the evil king is Eglon. I'm sorry, I may have said Ehud. Then Ehud enacts this huge victory. You've also made it through Deborah, who is our female judge, and she has a little run-in with this coward named Barak. And Barak doesn't want to go into battle without Deborah, and so Deborah says, fine, but because of that, the victory will be given to a woman, and in fact it is. The victory is given to Jael, this woman, who lures the captain of the Canaanite forces into her tent and then puts him to sleep and runs a tent peg through his temple. Boom, boom, boom. So awesome story there. Then you've got the story of Gideon. Gideon, who is kind of a scaredy cat and doesn't want to go into battle either. And God convinces Gideon to actually go into battle. And Gideon receives this wild victory with only 300 men that God has whittled down through this drinking contest. You'll have to look into that if you don't believe me, or read it in the synopsis. And the way that Gideon gains the victory is through torches and breaking pottery. So, great story. Then we've got Jephthah. Jephthah is a little bit more of a sad story because Jephthah is this kind of ragtag guy. He's kind of like, I guess you would think today of like somebody raised on the wrong side of the tracks, who's in a biker gang, who's a tough guy. But he does win the victory for Yahweh against the opponents. And then he sacrifices his daughter because he's made a vow to Yahweh that if he is victorious, he will sacrifice the very first thing that comes out of his house when he returns home. And it just so happens to be his daughter. So we've got this strange juxtaposition of the story of Abraham offering up his son Isaac, but not having to go through with it. And then Jephthah actually going through with offering his daughter. There's something fishy going on there that I don't quite understand. Then we've got Samson, and he is definitely the most comedic character of all. He, in your narrative, you probably read the synopsis. I can't remember quite what he does, but he has superhuman strength. So he is like our superhero of the Old Testament. He'd make a great Marvel comic guy or a DC comic guy. But in your narrative, you see him defeat the Philistines by acts of trickery and lots of strength. So we've got these 5 judges who they are flawed heroes, except for maybe Deborah. She's our only one that's not flawed. Ehud is a little bit odd because he's left-handed, and in the ancient world, I'm also left-handed, so any of you don't feel like I'm throwing shade on you for being left-handed, but in the ancient world, that was kind of disgusting. It was a mark that you were different and odd and strange, and that's actually been around for quite a while, that way of thinking about left-handedness. But Ehud is particularly comic because he is from the tribe of Benjamin, which means son of my right hand, and yet he's a left-handed guy. So a little bit of funny information there about Ehud. Then we've got Deborah, who's a woman. In the ancient world, that would have been kind of odd to have a woman leading you. Nevertheless, the author doesn't throw shade on Deborah for being a woman, but rather uses that as one of the sticking points of Yahweh's great success against the Canaanite military. Then we've got Gideon, who's kind of scared to go into battle. Then there's Jephthah, who's from the wrong side of the tracks, and also sacrifices his daughter, which I tend to think he probably should not have done. Then we've got Samson, who keeps falling in love with Philistine women. And these Philistine women he's not supposed to be getting together with, right? Because according to Deuteronomy, you're not supposed to marry foreigners because they might tempt you to worship their God. So he's a flawed character, even though he's super strong. So in each one of these judges, you can kind of see, this is interesting. These judges deliver Israel, but at the same time, they're quite flawed. And so that's something that you kind of have to hold in tension. Then by the end of the judges, we've got these two really strange stories. And what they do, they function to show us just how far away from God the people have moved, because they behave, how would you put it? They do things that are worse than people that do not follow Yahweh. So one of you had the story of the concubine, which is just a horrific story about a woman who, she and her husband, a concubine is like a lower level wife in the ancient world. And so she and her husband are seeking refuge in a town in Benjamin because they want to be in an Israelite town rather than a foreign town. And so they seek refuge in a town in Benjamin. And it's there that these evil men in the town want to have sex with the Levite. And the Levite instead offers up his wife, the concubine, for them to have sex with. They rape her. The men of the town rape her all night until the next morning she has died. And the Levite, her husband, takes her back to his town and cuts her into pieces and sends her out to the other tribes of Israel to call them to war against the Benjaminites. So let me just lay this out for you geographically really quickly. I mentioned to you that Benjamin's right here. And so she is raped and killed here, and the Levite goes back to his hometown and calls all of the other tribes to come against Benjamin and attack Benjamin for the evil that has happened in one of Benjamin's cities. So suddenly what we have here, rather than what we had in Joshua, where the Israelites were fighting against foreigners, now we have them fighting against themselves. So things have gotten really bad through the course of the judges. And then finally, what ends up happening is all of the men of the different tribes make a vow that they are not going to marry any of the women how does it go? All of the men of the tribes make a vow that they're not going to allow their daughters to marry any Benjaminite men, which makes perfect sense because this evil thing has happened. However, the Benjaminite men don't have enough wives, the ones that don't get killed in this infighting, in this battle, and there aren't enough wives for the Benjaminite men, and so they're told that they can come and snatch wives, they can steal wives at this festival. They can come and just kidnap women and force these women to be their wives. So if you're paying attention through the large swath of judges, we have these leaders that pop up and they are flawed heroes. And then let me go to this next slide for you. So the stories are interesting and they're fun, some of them are, and then by the end they get really awful. So one way that I want you to think about the story of the judges is as a downward spiral. So we keep seeing a judge rises up and things are going to be okay, and then the people start following idols and worshiping the gods of the nations again. So things are getting worse and worse and worse. So a way that we can see this downward spiral is in these different events throughout Judges where we see again and again the people of God fail to worship Yahweh, and instead they worship the gods of the nations around them. So you can see this downward spiral is taking place as they continue to worship other gods. And then here's your cycle. Israel will serve the Lord for a time, and then they will start worshiping other gods. and then they will become enslaved by the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Ammonites, any of these different ites. They'll cry out to the Lord, and God will raise up a judge, usually a flawed judge, that will deliver Israel, and Israel will serve the Lord for a certain amount of time, and then they will fall into sin and idolatry again. This is a pattern that repeats itself over and over again in Judges, but it doesn't just run in a cycle. It's a downward spiral. Things continue to get worse and worse, and there are a couple of different ways you can see that. You can see that here. As people continually don't follow God or God's ways. You can also see it here because things have gotten so bad by the time we get to Judges 19 that a woman is raped all night until she is dead, and the people of God fight against one another because of it. And also in chapter 21, where the people don't understand they don't understand what's right any longer. And so they come up with a terrible plan to have men come and steal women for their wives. And you can also see that spiral here as the years of peace become shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter as we go throughout the whole swath of Judges. So that is just to give you a taste of what's going on in Judges with these narratives. Things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And so even though when we left Joshua, we were kind of on a high note, we had all of the parts of the covenant with Abraham going really well. By the time we get to the end of Judges, it's almost like head in our hands and how could this have happened?